No, it's been an extraordinary day already. I've been traveling around and hearing fantastic things about the conversations and great ideas from the workshop, but we have an amazing panel to put some of the issues together for us. So I'm going to hand it over quickly to Enrique. Check your mic. Can you hear Enrique?
Hello? Can you hear me? Okay, that's working, I think. Great. Okay, cool. Let's do this. So thank you for being here. And thank you for putting some energy at the end or mid part of a long day. This is my first time here, by the way. And I'm curious about how many people here have been more than once. How many people have been here more than twice? And how many people have been for the whole 4 editions of this?
Wow.
Wow, okay. So there should be like some award at the end of this. Well, that's interesting. And so on the other side, it's like glad to see that there's so many new people. I was taking the shuttle to the conference from the airport, and from the 8 people that were in the shuttle, 8 of us were first-timers at the conference, and actually 8 of us were first-timers to Dayton. So there's something that makes me feel optimistic about people going to places for the first time, okay? So that said, I want to tell you a little bit of what's happening here. So my name is Enrique Piraces, with a big R, because you can see from my accent that I'm from somewhere in the South. And I'm going to be your pilot for the next 2 hours, right? So whatever that means, just fasten your seatbelts, and let's see. It's not maybe exciting, but it's going to be tricky. So I'm super excited to be here, and I'm actually very pleased to be able to introduce this second plenary of the Social Practice of Human Rights Conference. And the reason for that is because I think the goals of the conference, that is to bridge the divide between scholars and practitioners, enable critical reflection on human rights practice, and promote collaboration among the participants, are actually kind of key relevance today. You know? So as you know, there's 3 plenaries on this. You know, some of them are going to, all of them are going to explore how transformations are going to affect our practice or human rights practice in general. This one in particular, for those of us, or for those of you that may not know where you are, is about technological transformations, right? And this theme in particular is actually timely, if not urgent, right? And that is because technology continues to permeate and impact all aspects of our lives. In the context of human rights practice, technology has significantly altered the way we work as well as the environment that we work in. And as cliche as it may sound, technology will continue to advance at a faster pace, and we must be aware of their promise and peril. So in this panel, among other things, we hope to discuss what these technological transformations are going to be and what they may mean for our practice. Okay? And in that sense, what the future may look like and what type of preparedness or resilience we can build within our communities of practice. So to achieve that goal, I'm very grateful to have all of you here, as well as having 4 experienced practitioners. And also, I'm very happy to be, and this is my first time, to be able to be in a panel where all the speakers are women, which is not very common in the context of technology, right? So this is, and I have been to literally dozens of conferences. So I'm very happy for that from the beginning. So let me introduce first Ann Hudock, who is president and CEO of Counterpart International, Chloe Poynton, who is co-founder and principal at Article 1, Erin Mazursky, who is a founder and executive director of RHIZE, and Francesca Marotta, who is a Chief of Methodology, Education, and Training at the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. And what I think we could do, just for everybody to get a sense of who is here, is to do a quick round of introductions about who we are and what we're doing, and then maybe dive into some more substance issues. But we can go from that side to this side.
Sure. Hi, everyone. As Enrique said, I'm Erin Mazursky. I'm the founder and executive director of RHIZE. I hail from Brooklyn, New York. But RHIZE is a global organization, works primarily in the global south, that trains, networks, and supports social movements. The primary way that we work with movements is actually through developing a local coaches network. So it's really critical that we localize, and it's not just about foreign trainers coming in and leaving and saying good luck, but it's about really building long-term partnerships with movements. And so our coaches are experienced activists who we connect with each other, provide some facilitation skills, tools, and then have them work together in supporting some really amazing frontline movements around the world.
Hello, I'm Francesca Marotta, and I work on, as Enrique was saying, methodology, education, and training, development and implementation at the UN Human Rights Office. This is a position, it's in Geneva, it's a position I've had for quite a few years now, but I've worked as part of UN Human Rights in other countries to support and implement national human rights programs in Cambodia, Palestine, for example, more than once. Our job as methodology training and education is to develop guidance on methods of human rights work, and this is a very broad area, but we have some areas on which we focus in particular. For example, the conduct of human rights investigations into violations and methods to do that, use of data to assess human rights, so indicators, statistical methods applied to the human rights field, human rights in peace and security, and also technology applications to human rights, to human rights work. On this last point, our main entry point has really come from the need to strengthen investigative work, fact-finding and investigative work on human rights, and see what technology applications could help us do that. And when I say us, it's obviously our office, but also the human rights community more generally. And more broadly, obviously, we work on bringing human rights in the technology discourse, so informing choices about technology through the application of human rights standards. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ann Hudock, and I'm, first of all, a two-time University of Dayton grad, which is why I have my University of Dayton water bottle. I should hasten to add, though, that it wasn't that I didn't do the degree well the first time. It was 2 different degrees that I did here. So I'm thrilled to be back home on campus with all of you, and I'm also privileged to be a member of the advisory board of the Center for Human Rights here. So really proud to see everyone come together. And I've been working at Counterpart International, and I'm the president and CEO there. And Counterpart is an organization that I think is really geared to local community development. You know, our mission is to support communities around the world in solving their problems, and us working alongside of them as either a catalyst or helping to support them with technical assistance or resources that we help them to leverage. And we work everywhere from Afghanistan to Central America, and we're very privileged to have Milady, who is our chief of party in El Salvador. Many of you have probably heard from her earlier today as she talked about our important human rights work there. So if you really want to know what Counterpart does, Milady is the person to give you the frontline perspective. And the only thing I wanted to add about Counterpart, which I think is relevant to these discussions, is we have a couple of programs that I'll talk a little bit about that really use technology to advance development. But I think what's even more important is that we were founded as an organization rooted in communities. And we were founded by a priest and a movie star. And those are probably 2 of the most unlikely partners you could find. And we're not a religious organization, but that origin story for me is a really important one as we think about how we solve these very complex problems of technology and human rights and the challenges that are with all of us, because I think we all need to think about some unlikely and surprising partnerships to do that.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Chloe Poynton, and thrilled to be here. I'm principal and co-founder at Article 1. We're a business and human rights advisory firm that works mostly with large multinationals on advancing corporate respect for human rights, so helping them understand the ways in which their products, services, operations affect human rights, and then developing strategies to mitigate those potential impacts. So I'm coming at this discussion from a little bit of a different perspective from the companies that actually develop and deploy this technology. And so I'll have that lens on throughout this conversation. My background, though, is much more traditional human rights, field-based work, working with the UN and transitional justice NGOs. So it's nice to be back at the seat of this work for me.
Thank you. So one thing, and maybe this is good for all of you to know, so what's going to happen here is that I think that, especially after seeing the panel this morning, is that we're going to try to go through some questions that we think are relevant as a way to kind of share with you some of the experience and perspective that we have, and we're going to try to get as fast as we can to, a conversation with all of us that will, I hope, include you as soon as possible. So from there, what I would like to do is, well, also tell you who I am and my side of this deal. So as I mentioned before, I'm Enrique Piraces. That continues to be my name as of now, and I have different hats. So, and I really have many hats, and I have had many hats over the years. So I'm here with all of those hats. I am right now the program manager at the Center for Human Rights Science at Carnegie Mellon University, which is a small center that promotes accountability and justice from the intersection of human rights and science. And we do this by both creating links between technologies and scientists, as well as providing ethical guidance on the use and adoption or perhaps rejection of technology. We have done work that ranges from DNA or some genomic issues all the way to the collection of digital evidence. We have done this with the International Criminal Court, with large organizations, with small projects. And it's an initiative that is interesting itself because it's based in academia, but it's becoming an interesting force as pushing the boundaries of the university to almost become a part of civil society. I'm also part of an initiative called Just Labs that you may have heard or seen because it's attached to the organization of this conference. And Just Labs is an organization that is based in Colombia, in Bogota, and that is aiming at using new methods to try to do some problem solving around human rights practice. For those of you that want to know more, there's going to be workshops every day around each one of the main themes of the conference. And there's also Arten and Lucas who are around here and who you'll be able to ask anything you want about. The other project that I'm related that is, and I think all of this is relevant because it's going to explain somehow why my perspective is the one it is. I'm also part of something called RHIZE Collab, which is also a new initiative and that is looking at how finance, society, civil society, technology intersect and how is that we can think of new forms of organizing around a human rights practice. If you want to learn more about that, there is some of my colleagues here. There is Ed, Joanne, and Paul, who you are going to be able to, there's Ed over there, and there's a few sessions that they will be running. But anyway, that's kind of my background. It's a little bit composite. So my practice comes from 20 years of doing things like this from multiple places, before technology and human rights became a formal intersection. So a lot of my experience comes from being very opportunistic and adaptive, and often misinformed and learning on the fly. So also failing, right? There's a lot of things that come from that. So I think that one way that maybe we can kick off our conversation is related to the main question that was posed to us as panelists, which is, what is the problem and what does going against the grain mean, right? So framing something like this, it's a complex problem. It could be challenging, but also could be kind of fun because there's a lot of space to think of things. From my perspective, and again, there is at least two things that should be considered among many. On the one end is the kind of like the societal issues, and then the issues around technology itself. So a lot of this is going to sound like obvious cliches, but I think they are relevant because I believe they hold truth. So we live in times that are of significant change, right? And this is something that probably was told at every conference over the last 100 years. But they feel, and maybe it's because it's our experience of life, they feel, of times also of tremendous pressure and urgency, right? So we live in a world where borders are porous and diffuse, where the balance of global power seems to be changing or shifting, or if it's not just being shattered, where inequality is growing at an alarming pace, where the destruction of both the social fabric and the ecosystems that we need to just exist are disappearing or are being significantly threatened. And in that sense, how we feel it's a moment where the very basic infrastructure that we need to operate is being, affected by our own society. And particularly relevant for the conversation around human rights practice, we see that the movement itself is perceiving a moment of transformation, if not crisis, right? And this gets exacerbated by, for example, the growing number of populist regimes that are challenging our understanding of democracies and human rights, and all the way to the very deliberate attempts by mostly government actors to asphyxiate civil society in many places. So the moment feels very harsh, very complex, right? On the other side, there's technology, right, that continues to drive human existence at an accelerated and often unchecked pace, right? This often happens against obsolete legal frameworks or legislating mechanisms, and often against a backdrop of techno-optimist propaganda corporations that often prefer minimal regulations, which gets exacerbated by the commonly hyperbolic claims of media. So technology is a bigger, weird thing. And in that sense, which is not small, the difficulty of regulation and governance of technology presents a significant challenge to address in terms of the human rights impact of their use and adoption. So, true, there's a lot of interesting things that have happened in these times in terms of like the important and even successful efforts led by civil society around these issues. But the reality is that the balance of power is tilted against civil society. So in thinking of technology in practice, we also need to consider that human rights practitioners are often unable to fully understand the scope or the impact of technology. It's a big challenge given that technology is, it's prevalent, it's growing in its importance. So if you think of this, when we talk about technology, when others talk about technology, at the end of the day, most people are going to be talking either about social media or the internet. And the reality is that technology is much more complex. If you think of artificial intelligence, even that is, we're talking about computational technology. We're not talking about the very wide range of technologies available. And that is, in many ways, is problematic. This narrowness is problematic because, on the one end, doesn't provide a much needed solid understanding of what is the what, both in terms of possibilities and in terms of challenges. And on the other end, creates this curtain, this wall between us and the true actors and behind the technology and the agendas that they have, right? There is an author who I don't want to mention because I don't think that he should be necessarily like promoted, but that talks about technology as this technine, as about this thing that flies in the universe. And it's kind of the way we act. We talk about technology and we just put it there as, if genomic technology or aerospace technology were all the same. And it's not. And it's very important that at some point, we understand what is happening. So in that sense, what is the problem? So the problem is that we're living in times of accelerated pace where technology plays a growing critical role in both in an environment that lacks of governance and where practitioners lack of adequate avenues to understand, adapt, or resist technology, right? So it sounds a little bit bleak, right? Like it's a lot of motion, nobody knows what's happening, and we don't have the ability to act on that. Now, I do think that perhaps the bigger problem or the meta problem is in that sense pessimism. When we see this wall of things, we tend to think pessimistically about what is ahead. And I think that, and this is perhaps the first thing to go against the grain, is to actually understand that there is many voices of reasons in this sea of insanity that can help us find what I would like to call a blueprint for optimism. So I hope that through the panel we can find some of those examples and find some of those excuses to connect this moment with some much needed optimism. So now the second part of the question before I pass this to the rest of you is about what does going against the grain mean? And I had a hard time, to be very frank, understanding that. And it's funny because I'm a knife maker, right? So I often work with steel and wood, and I have to sand them, right? So sanding is something that I do pretty much every day. When I pretend to be working, I'm actually probably in the workshop doing these things. And I had a hard time understanding this, and it's like, what does it mean? I read, some what the Pope said. And yeah, of course, it's about equality in the way this framed originally. So I spent several days, like afternoons maybe, or maybe nights, thinking about these things. And I thought that maybe it's about the big things, right? Maybe it's about things that have to do with, maybe going against the grain is about rejecting this dystopia versus utopia simplistic way of understanding technology, right? The media is either going to tell us that blockchain is the next big thing, or it's going to tell us that robots are going to take over the world, right? And we're going to move, in this very confusing way to that. And I think that maybe going against the grain is reject the simplistic thing, kind of become way more informed, and maybe it's by building connections with savvy technologies, with available scientists to better understand the nuances of this. So that would be perhaps one thing. And then I also thought that, well, we also think of technology as something that just happens, and maybe something that happens commercially, but technology, especially in the context of human rights practice, is transferred often. It's created in one place and then moved to another to be used. And if you think about, for example, most of the technology that is used for counter-surveillance on anonymity is mostly funded by the State Department and some of the private foundations in the US. When that technology is shown to organizations in Mexico, Colombia, Afghanistan, and the like, it's moving a particular way. And it's normally moved along the lines of international cooperation. And that means that is often moved with structures that consider verticality unilaterally, like a bigger, savvier, wealthier peer that is able to help someone doesn't know much. And that is very complicated. And perhaps going against the grain means of thinking of alternative models for technology transfer. And perhaps it's about thinking of transnational solidarity, ways in which we think of the other as peers. I also think that maybe going against the grain is about creating connections between communities of practice that right now are siloed, right? If you think of the people that I work with, I work in a university that has 90 PhD students in just computer vision, which is just one aspect of artificial intelligence. And most of those people that are creating the future of the things that we're going to use are absolutely disconnected from our problems. If artificial intelligence is what, next to perhaps climate change, is one of the big things that we need to face, why is that we're not connecting those communities? And another thing that perhaps is going against the grain, and this is almost the end of this preliminary statement, is maybe interrogate or revisit, review, revise the way we are engaging with technology. Right now we do it in what I think is a very simplistic manner, generally speaking. For those of you in academia that are working in STS or the like, you probably have a much more sophisticated approach. But there's ways, there's things that we can see today that are much different and much more complex. We could take a look at gender HCI or feminist human-computer interaction, post-colonial computing, anti-oppressive design. There's ways where technology is being now explored connected to societal issues, and perhaps going against the grain again means taking this, and these much more challenging approaches to review what we're doing. Also, perhaps consider, the environment and the inequality crisis that we're seeing, and consider how that is interacting. And that is perhaps the biggest and the most challenging thing on all conversations, because at the end of the day, for many of us, you're going to see that they're all rooted in the system that we are trying to alter. There's a limit to what we can do. And perhaps at some point, it's going to be necessary for us to be a bit more expansive in the things that we consider. And it's true, liberal democracies are being challenged, right? And there is tremendous pressures against them. But it's also possible that they're not sufficient to address the things that we need. I mean, I am surprised that in these environments, we're not talking about things like feminist eco-socialism as a viable alternative, right? Or others, right? So I think that perhaps going against the grain means, maybe removing the post-Cold War fear of bringing some uncomfortable political topics and review the way we, by engaging with technology, may be actually reducing our possibility to change the system. So anyway, this happened, as you can see, mostly at night, which might have been fueled by wine. But I think that at the end of the day, it will be very interesting for us to explore this conversation together. What is the problem, and what is that we think going at the grains means. So I'm going to open this for us, and we can start in any direction. So we'll do it here,
Sure.
And then we can switch some shuffle of the playlist.
Perfect. Sounds good. Well, first of all, that was an amazing introduction. I feel like I just want to pass it back to you and keep hearing you and your amazing thoughts. But I want to kind of frame this a little bit in terms of the work that we do. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we work a lot with companies on addressing human rights impacts. And a big focus area we have is with the tech sector. So we did the first human rights impact assessment of artificial intelligence that was ever done in collaboration with Microsoft, and we host the Business Roundtable on Human Rights and AI, which works with the world's leading developers and deployers of AI to try and integrate human rights considerations into both the design and sale of AI technologies. And what we found in those engagements is that there's obviously huge potential for technology to be this force for good. In fact, when we think about, for example, tackling some of the world's diseases, this is a real promise, is looking at vast quantities of data and being able to process it at amazing speeds to really try and come up with solutions that have, to date, not been possible. But there's obviously significant, as you said, peril associated with technologies, and making sure that we are thinking about those, not just in terms of what is the technology designed to do, but what are the potential unintended consequences of that technology, what happens if that technology is in the wrong hands, what happens if that technology is used on vulnerable populations. and thinking through the different kind of ways in which companies and states need to be responsive to that. So for me, this is really around the going against the grain, maybe actually going back to basics and going back to the roots. So my sense is that we actually have the tools to think about this in the right kinds of ways, and the tools are outlined in the International Human Rights Framework. So if we think about it, I think there's kind of three big reasons why, if we apply the human rights framework both to kind of government regulation and use of technology and the ways in which companies are supposed to develop and deploy it responsibly, we're going to end up in a better situation. And there's three reasons. So the first, for me, is really that while technology can impact human rights in new ways, right? So discrimination can occur in a new way through bias and algorithmic decision making. The right to non-discrimination is already protected and enshrined in the International Bill of Rights. So that's the first thing. The second is that unlike ethics or CSR, which is kind of wishy-washy and we don't really have clear definitions of it, human rights is a clearly articulated framework with a common language and a common set of norms. And so not only does it provide us with this shared language, but it also provides us with this important moral compass. And the third, and I think this is the most important, is that if technology isn't deployed into a rights-respecting world, it will be used in bad ways. So it doesn't matter how much due diligence we do up front, how much thinking we do about the ways in which it can be misused. If it's put out into the world, it can be used by forces for negative impacts. And I want to actually quote the outgoing High Commissioner for Human Rights from your agency, who used the example of flight in a great op-ed in the Washington Post. And he said that when flight was first invented, it was this amazing tool that brought the world closer together, right? So it allowed people to travel significant distances. It allowed for more interaction between different cultures and communities. But then during World War II, flight was the reason why the atomic bomb was able to be dropped. Same technology, drastically different outcomes. He writes, again, this is in the Washington Post, when the global order is improving, when there's peace and prosperity, liberal democracies are expanding, repression is withering away, and human rights are being honored, chances are technology will generally be put to good use. If the situation is the opposite, when liberal democracies are failing, repression spreads, human rights are violated, and nations are engulfed by war, technology will become a partner of bad intentions. And so for me, it's really around making sure that we hold states and companies accountable for, in the case of states, for the international framework that most of them have ratified and agreed to, and making sure that they are thinking about this in the context of technologies and ways that it can be misused. And then from the company's perspective, we have a roadmap for how to think about this. And yes, it's going to be complicated to implement it from a technology perspective, but it's not impossible. And so my plea for this conversation and my plea in terms of both engagements with states and governments is we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Even though we have new technologies, we have tools to address it.
Thank you.
Great. So we didn't coordinate this, but for me, I really think that going against the grain is a couple of things. And the widest aperture, as an individual and as a leader, I don't understand how to go with the grain. Because in my view, going with the grain is what gets us into the institutionalized, systematized, repressive, confining regimes or orders that we want to fight against. So for me, this work is only about going against the grain. And I think that's really important. And I was very taken with the theme. And I think it boils down to, going with the grain is seeing the world as it is. And going against the grain is looking at the world as it should be. And in my view, we should only be focused on the latter. And I think the greatest threat to human rights today is the passive acceptance of the status quo. And so it's almost a call to action to go against the grain. And I think, that is really critical. So when I look at technology, and this is the piece that I think sort of follows on from some of what you were saying, is we talk a lot about technology being a force for good, and we talk a lot about the potential of technology to advance human rights. And the thing we talk about less, and so this is why it's going against the grain, is technology can be used to actually weaponize and be turned against society. And I think too often we're looking at it as how does it amplify the voices of the marginalized, or how does it level the playing field? How does it confine power and ensure accountability? And in fact, if you just look at examples from around the world, for instance, if you take Malaysia and Sri Lanka, you have instances of fake news that, on social media that have actually resulted in frontline conflicts between Buddhists and Muslims, where in Sri Lanka you had Facebook posts that were falsely alleging that Muslim shopkeepers were putting poison and sterilization pills into food served at Buddhist counters. And this led to such a violent outburst that one man was burned to death. These are horrific things that are based around technology having been at the center of that. In Myanmar, there was a study commissioned by Facebook that found that military officials were using fake news to incite violence against the Rohingya minority. And that really helped to set the stage for what the UN officials have described as ethnic cleansing. So, the examples abound. And while I love the idea of a blueprint for optimism, I also think we really need a blueprint for caution and for a different kind of engagement so that we can think about ways in which technology, while it can be harnessed for good, it's also going to be harnessed for many things that are less than good and even worse. And so I think we have to really wrestle with that.
As I said, I come to the issue from the perspective of a global human rights organization that has been thinking of how we can use our tools, our means, our position, our convening power to basically work at two levels. How to contribute to making sure that policies and regulations related to development and deployment of technology actually are in line with human rights standards, and how, as Ann was saying, the technology can actually be harnessed to do good for the benefit of societies. And there are a lot of examples about how this is already happening. For example, improving health system, improving transport, access to justice, etc. Obviously, I think we'll explore more how the dark side of this as well. But we all agree there are positive angles. Because of the pervasive presence of technology in our societies, I think one of the biggest challenges for the human rights movement in the future is how to ensure, actually in the present and our future, is how to ensure that the human rights framework that I agree with Chloe is there to guide us and is relevant, can actually be implemented in our digital environment. And I fully agree, and I cannot disagree with Chloe since she quoted my former boss, that obviously the human rights framework gives us a very solid basis for coders, engineers, business people, human rights lawyers to come together and discuss what does it mean in terms of how we use, develop, or stop the use of certain technologies, for example. But I want to add to that something more. So it's not just the human rights framework, but also for us to think how we can use international human rights mechanisms and traditional human rights work to reduce the risks attached to technologies that are either badly developed or badly used. And I want to use precisely the example of Myanmar, which Anne referred to, and give you a bit of an inside story. As you may know, in 2018, an independent fact-finding mission on Myanmar that was set up by the United Nations came up with a report that pointed to the very negative role that Facebook had played in Myanmar in promoting hatred, violence, in Myanmar, groups one against each other, and obviously against the Rohingyas in particular, and how it had also been used through fake news, propaganda, dissemination of false information to actually play groups one against each other and lead into a lot of violence. The report quotes mentions Facebook 179 times, just to give you an idea of either as a source of the information, which is the other side of it. The social media as an increasing source of information to be taken with caution and analyzed and assessed with caution. But anyway, information for human rights fact-finding investigations, but also as an avenue for to support and facilitate human rights violations. And as OHCHR, we had already started engaging with Facebook and trying to get them into a conversation on content moderation and how Facebook can play a positive role as opposed to being again an avenue for propagating hatred or violence in some cases, but obviously so with mixed success. When the report of the fact-finding mission came out, it was a watershed moment. The interaction, the conversation changed entirely. There was obviously a strong exposure of the responsibility of Facebook in not having taken measures, and not for want of trying, because it had been at least 2 years that the human rights community had raised the problem related to Facebook, which is really the only social media, or at least at the time was, that is used in Myanmar, and really for lots of communications, government uses it also for communications with the population, etc. So suddenly they had to deal, and then of course there was the Cambridge Analytica thing that came out, scandal that came out more or less at the same time. But they really had to come to terms with the fact that there is a human rights framework, there are human rights actors. There is human rights advocacy. There is some sort of accountability, if it's not as strong as we would like to, vis-a-vis the public. And so we have really seen a change in the interaction. And of course, the impact assessment that then they undertook followed this public exposure of their failures. As I said, until then, there wasn't no action was being taken. We also entered into an agreement with Facebook, under the so-called trusted partner channel that some of you may know about. So it's an agreement whereby users can raise with Facebook contents that actually can amount to incitement to hatred, right? And ask for the removal of their content, which raises a lot of other issues, which maybe we can talk about later in terms of how do you assess that content. So, so this is to say a human rights framework, a human rights legal framework that some think is too state-centric to be relevant today, actually was the basis to engage a major non-state actor like Facebook, and prompt some action in the sense of being more respectful of human rights. So I think this can be an example or an inspiration for us of how to think of all the tools that we have to to push development and use of technology in the good direction. And of course, when I was talking earlier about the traditional human rights method, this was the result of traditional human rights monitoring and fact-finding. So this is the core of human rights work, right? So it's a report that is well documented that points to responsibilities and violations that can be used as a very strong tool for public advocacy. Yeah, I'll leave it there maybe now.
Thank you. Great. So. Sorry, so I've been, well, actually, before I start, given my work is on social movements, that's something that we all experience, we all see in our lives, and I'm just curious, just in like popcorn style, to name some movements that have inspired you over the last decade. If that just anyone wants to volunteer. Yeah.
Free Burma.
Free Burma movement, yeah. It's been around even longer, but yes, yeah. Yeah. Me Too, yeah, absolutely. Immigrant rights movement, yeah, in the US and globally. Sorry, say that one? Idle no more, absolutely.
Pro-democracy movements in the Arab Spring.
Yeah, pro-democracy movements, many of which in the last decade, and the Arab Spring or Arab Awakening, yeah. Black Lives Matter.
The repeal of the Eighth Amendment in Ireland?
Repeal of the Eighth Amendment in Ireland, great example. So I'm seeing a lot of hands. There are an incredible amount of movements just over the last decade, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but just to keep that kind of like front of mind in this conversation. So I've been a lifelong organizer and activist, and a lot of my work, especially over the last 10, 15 years, has really stemmed from the conviction that social movements are really the bedrock of human rights. They're a critical vehicle for how we enact and achieve human rights. And in a lot of ways, because of the communities they help to build, the diverse constituencies they bring together, they often help develop alternative extra-institutional solutions when normal institutions fail, and ultimately help create a really rooted power that can take on a cross-section of issues at the very local level. And so for me, growing against the grain is about how to look at different ways to apply the human rights framework and different approaches and mechanisms. And oftentimes in the case of movements, not necessarily through traditional institutions, as when I was studying human rights as a student, we were sort of traditionally taught. I think that human rights, as we talk about it today, we often talk more about systems of oppression and how not just we ensure our legal institutions are upholding human rights, but how we ensure at the cultural, behavioral, social level, we're also assuming and upholding human rights. And so the questions I ask in my work, and I really feel that work is sort of driven by questions oftentimes versus answers, but is how we build and change power structures, and for me, with movements as a vehicle, so that we can be in more of a position to support the leadership of communities than to be the leaders ourselves. And so just a little bit of background, because I was reflecting a lot on kind of how human rights, even just over my career, has changed. So I got my start in 2004 when I was helping to build what was then a student-led human rights movement against the genocide in Darfur. The movement emerged at a time when the US's role was pretty different. And we perhaps naively saw a clear theory of change between building American political will and the US's ability to create change around the world. And we used human rights, the human rights context in order to do that. And interestingly enough, 2004 was actually the same year that Facebook made an appearance on college campuses, which was, for those of you who don't know, the initial place where Facebook took hold is if you had an ADU account, that was the only way you could get on Facebook. And it allowed us to organize and spread the movement across the US and actually ultimately internationally in what became the largest human rights movement at that time, and it hadn't been as big, a movement that size hadn't been as big since the anti-apartheid movement. That's what I was trying to say. But so looking back now, obviously the US's role has shifted dramatically. My own understanding of movement work has changed as well. And global rights movements don't have the same power as they used to. But that's in some ways good, because what we've seen is the increasing power of locally led movements and the localization of human rights and human rights issues. And so what that means for us as a human rights community is that we need to adapt our approaches and adapt the way we think about human rights and the mechanisms in which we work to uphold it. We tend to still really approach issues in silos. And for example, as we all know, climate change, when we look at frontline communities who are facing them, don't just look at climate justice as a climate issue, but as a matter of gender equality, land rights, economic access, along the lines of ethnic and racial bounds. And so, the nuance of human rights today really forces us to think about the ways and categories in which we think about these things. It's not just about the Sustainable Development Goals, but it's, how do those issues really play out at the local level? And so, similar to my fellow panelists, tech with movements in particular plays both a positive and has played a negative role. On the positive side, it's helped us develop really effective narratives and helped us find people of like-mindedness so that we can organize more effectively. And narrative development is a really critical first step in movement formation. Tech also has helped us, as we've seen, see the rise in many mass movements across the world in the last decade. There's more movements in the last decade than the prior 3 decades combined. And that's in part because of social movements, because of technology. In Colombia, in Moldova, the Armenian Revolution, the recent revolution in Sudan, the Green Revolution in Iran, the Arab Awakening. I mean, I could go on. And it's huge and impressive and inspiring. It's allowed us to develop better advocacy tools that have helped us have mass petitioning, which has led to more short-term policy wins. And it's also helped as a tool to help keep activists more safe through things like VPN and Tor, which actually were recently and widely used in the recent Sudan revolution so effectively that once the government shut down the internet, the government was using VPN and Tor. So that's, there's a lot of positive things about tech. As we also know, and we've talked about this already and we'll talk about it more, negative effects are there's more polarization and less dialogue, right? We've come to see that and that's become proven. We've put very high stakes bets on local human rights organizations that face increasingly repressive environments. And so, what's that meant is that we've overinvested in technology in a way that has meant that we underinvest in people and new ways of collaborating and develop relationships. And I've seen sort of that overinvestment mean that we forget what really makes movements work in the first place. And so, actually all of this has led to an ultimate decrease in the success of movements over the last decade. So while we see more movements, we see less success over time. There's a lot of things to conclude about this, but some of it is that movements are much more short-lived, and so while you can get mass mobilization at once, you see less long-term relationship building and organizing happening. Because what we see is there's a protest and that's what we're supposed to be doing. What we don't see is that actually there's a whole strategy, there's skills, there's leadership, there's decentralization that has to take place in order for movements to really get that rootedness that are going to make them successful. So I think that, to me, it's that, yes, we must keep innovating technology to help us better connect with each other and keep frontline defenders safe. We have to continue to stay ahead of the autocratic learning curve because authoritarians continue to learn and adapt from each other's tactics. But I also think that one of our biggest challenges is somewhat more basic than just how do we advance technology, which is, I think, what all of us are saying. It's how are we looking at supported, stronger, more local rootedness in human rights culture in a way that has more direct relevance to the people truly on the front lines. For a long time, human rights, like I said, has operated at very high levels, and I think going against the grain is about how we democratize human rights and make human rights more accessible by those most directly affected by injustice. And so I think those answers lie in confronting old power structures and conceiving power in a way that uplifts people and grassroots-led change.
Great, thank you. This is fascinating in many ways, and I'm thinking that just the speed that we're taking, maybe we just need to speed up until that moment where you can choose your own adventure and tell us where to go. So what I suggest is just to have like one quick question around like the future and maybe just get you ready to be engaged with this. There's several things that have come here that have been very interesting, and I hope that we can access the recording of this because I would like to hear some of this again. I was thinking just after hearing you, Erin, about how interesting it is that in a way, as we rely more on technology for our social activism or our human rights practice, it also means that we're going to be moving this practice to be mediated by companies, right? And there's something to be explored there. Perhaps not now, perhaps during the questions, but it's something that came rapidly, right? I remember reading something about this. There was this, and I'm just going to do this because I do it all the time, but there's this guy called Ivan Illich, not Lenin, the other one. And he has this paper in 1985 in some conference in Tokyo. And it's a super simplistic, super basic and direct metaphor about he was growing in Dalmatia, or his grandfather was growing in Dalmatia, and the first megaphone arrived to the village, the fishing village, and what it meant for the first person to have a louder voice than others, and for that to be mediated. And I think that there may be a line of thought that we could explore in the questions around that complexity. But the other bit that I think we need to address, just in thinking that we're talking about technological transformation, is about what's going to happen. What is the tech that is going to transform our spaces? We have seen significant change. Like if you think, of course, social media, right? Of course, mobile phones and the penetration of smartphones in places that are quite remote. But we also have seen the possibility of accessing remote imagery, like of places. Satellite imagery has been a significant transformation for our practice. So what else is out there that is going to come? Like we know, for example, that companies like Planet Labs are offering, directly or indirectly, even the possibility for a human rights organization to have a private satellite. We have heard about the promise and peril of AI, right? What else is out there? So I'm curious about what we all think it's coming, and it's something that we should be paying attention as practitioners of human rights, especially for those that are coming as the renewing generation, right? What is that we need to be prepared for in any order that we want?
I'll be happy to start from the middle. So I think, as we look to the future, we have to also think about where we are now. And I think for all of us in this audience, it's very easy to get caught up in the excitement of tech because we have the privilege of resources and connectivity. But, thinking about the local power and the local issues, the frontline human rights defenders, around the world, it's really only 6 out of 10 people who are connected to the internet. And if you think about that in terms of gender and you break it down into rural areas, women have less access to the internet and people in rural areas have even more limited. We hear all the stories of how great it is to have rural villages connected and things, but the reality is that isn't still the norm. And so when we think about the future, we have to also think about bringing those really important, because I completely agree, the local leadership, it's the ethos of what Counterpart does. Those are the people who are leading change and leading the future. So, I say that to look ahead. And I think when we think about what's going to make a difference, in my mind, it's really the networks. And network-centered innovation is something that Counterpart does around the world. And we cultivate, fund, and help sustain regionally focused, regionally managed networks of CSOs, civil society organizations, in the human rights space. And why I started with that notion of improbable partners is because within these networks we have activists, human rights lawyers, civic technologists, and journalists. And together, they're developing viable governance structures which give them the tools and resources to come up with their own approaches towards the problems that they see. And so technology is a driver of instability right now, but it's also, as we recognize, an enabler of possibilities. And so I think for the future, we have to really look at that network-centered innovation. And in large part, we have to do it because there's safety in numbers. And, if I look around, I was just in Zambia last week, a country I used to call home, and only 4 years later to go back, that is an entirely different space for civil society than it was when I lived there 4 years ago. And so when you talk about the rise of authoritarianism and closing civic space, it's happening around the world. It's happening in places that were once considered the beacons of democracy. And, to go back to my University of Dayton days, I was once the editor of the Flyer News student newspaper, and I very happily took for granted in this country media freedom. And in this day right now, I'm raising 4 children to teach them that you must never take for granted media freedom, because in this country, a place I never envisioned that we would have to think about this, we need to think about this and do more than think about this. So again, I think the future is really in the power of those networks, and it's in the power of making sure that the right voices are included, and that those of us who are in privileged positions are taking that back seat to make sure that the local leaders who know the risks, who understand the context, and who already generally have the solutions that are technologically appropriate, that they're in the driver's seat, and that what we're doing is coming behind.
Great, thank you.
I'm happy to jump in. Erin mentioned democratizing human rights, and I fundamentally agree with that. And if I were at a technology conference, what I would hear is democratizing access to technology. And there's a lot of benefits to that, but it's also, I think, a rush to democratization of the technology that is such a powerful force that could present significant challenges. So if we think about deepfakes, for example, or synthetic media, when we had someone had a good session earlier about this and looked at the Forrest Gump talking to JFK, and that was, multi-million-dollar movie with all of the power of Hollywood behind it. Now you can buy a deepfake for like $20 if you want to do a deepfake porn video. That access and the ability to use those tools, which are so incredibly powerful and have the ability to affect people's lives in really tremendous ways, I think we need to step back and think about what that actually means. And democracy and democratization is a kind of a knee-jerk reaction to that's good. We want that. We have to have that. That's a powerful force. But there are instances where it actually can have the reverse impacts and solidify power, or have the ability to really curtail the rights of vulnerable and marginalized populations. So when I think about the future, I think about this question of democratization and what it means, and how do we try to put limits on it in a way that ensures the protection of rights without just steamrolling towards innovation at all costs.
I have a bit of a cynical perspective on this, because the thing that came to mind when you asked that question was like the regulation of Facebook, that I'm excited about regulating the technologies that we have, because they have been I think incredibly harmful, and I think have been approached in a way that we just accept are the thing that we all need, and yet is also responsible for a genocide against entire people and mass polarization, incredible assault to our democracy and risk to our election systems. And those threats to me are so much more serious than the assets that they bring. I think at this point we have other ways of connecting, and I look forward to a world in which we find those alternative ways en masse in a really different way. I think I'm not by any means advocating for like everybody get off Facebook, because it's a weird. Some people would, and I think those are all valid arguments. But I think that it is a powerful organizing tool, and for so many people, particularly in the Global South, it's the only organizing tool that they have. But it's also at great risk to their security without them knowing that all the time. We deal with that with our activists all the time. And so, yeah, I think I don't have like great examples to point to, other than I'm hopeful that this is a conversation that we are starting, and that we can come to both a solution about the current problem and hopefully, look at the next frontier rather than trying to figure out what the next Facebook is. So that's what I'll say.
Maybe just flowing from what Erin is saying, I think looking ahead, we need to be mindful, I think, of two particular areas of risk. And I'm sorry to go back to risk, but I think it's linked to what we do. One is technology and shrinking civic space, basically. And so this whole issue of how surveillance systems or online attacks are basically affecting the work of dissenter voices, human rights defenders, journalists, political, people in political opposition. And so we're seeing really very targeted attacks, and of course it's very important that we organize ourselves to monitor those more systematically, because online attacks we see can become, real life attacks often, especially when it comes to human rights defenders. So as a human rights movement, how do we get organized better to have proper real-time information about what is going on at that level and what kind of responses we can have, which are not necessarily the traditional responses, like in terms of physical attacks on people that we are used to deal with. The other aspect I wanted to bring up is the issue of, in terms of artificial intelligence and discrimination, which I think we have, hinted to previously. So how can we be more alerted and more proactive rather than reactive in terms of the discriminatory impact of artificial intelligence-based technologies? For example, again, which linked to the use of big data and basically the profiling that is happening for any of us who is using social media about our thoughts, what we read, our political preferences, our friends, what kind of diseases do we look up for on internet, maybe because we are not well or somebody in our family is not well, and how can this impact, does this translate into possible discrimination, in terms of the health insurance that we have, the financial loans that we get. So it's the jobs that we get. I think you may remember a news that came up some months ago about Amazon using an artificial intelligence system to vet new employees. That was, of course, these systems work based on, they get trained, right? A lot of information, and then they react based on the information that has been given to them. The information that had been given to this system was information about past Amazon employees, who were primarily men. So the system was filtering out more or less, more easily women applicants because they didn't match, what they had been trained to, to screen. So what does it mean in terms of AI applications without a mind to discriminatory impact? What does it mean in terms of our lives, but also our rights, right? Because these are all issues that are human rights as well. And so looking at the future, I think we need to think of some more rigorous system to test new technologies, maybe in safe environments before they are actually deployed. And I think this is something that can be done only if we work more on this, cooperation we've all been calling for between different professions, human rights, as I said, coders, technology experts. In the business field, there is this regulatory sandbox model. As you know, these are safe environments in which certain technologies enterprises can pilot or certain technologies and see what impact they have before they actually get marketed. And it's I think there are some regulations in certain states that actually provide for this, or in certain sectors, so that there is no economic loss, no big economic loss to the enterprise, but also, as I said, the impact of new technologies assessed before they are produced on a larger scale. Why not thinking of including a human rights dimension into this regulatory framework, so that new technology can be assessed in terms of the potential impact on human rights, negative impact, before producing them on a large scale? And so this could be, a model that brings together all the communities that need to work together to advance on this issue in a way that is constructive and not disruptive of social fabrics and, and rights.
Thank you. I think this is quite interesting for me because to the question about what technological transformation is going to impact, all of you reacted with something that is pretty society-driven. And it's very interesting. Like, I think it's, in a way, it's invigorating to think that even when we think about the future, we can consider, the digital divide, like the divide that exists in terms of access as something important, the idea of democratization of access to things, the idea of governance. And I think that this is perhaps one of those moments that justifies like the need to have this, interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary approach to things. Because I can tell you that this is a very valuable thing, and it's a conversation that doesn't happen in most spaces where technology is discussed, where the real technological advances are going to come. So we can talk about homomorphic encryption or secure multi-party computation that at the end of the day, regardless of their name and how it stands for us, are things that are going to perhaps allow for the protection of the data of vulnerable populations. Right? And that's a thing that doesn't exist connected to these conversations. Or we can think about what the next generation of batteries is going to mean to access, for people to have access to devices for 6 or 7 days, like 6 or 7 days over time. Or what's going to happen when we have access to sensors of other nature to monitor the environment. And I think that there's a necessary conversation where these technological transformations need to intertwine with others. And this perhaps may be a good moment to see if any of you, have anything to share or to ask. Otherwise, there's a few other things that we could explore. But if you want, maybe we can make this a bigger. So I don't know if you want to tell us from there, because I think we can hear, or there's microphones. But if you could just introduce yourself.
Yeah. That was fascinating and really interesting, and I don't know a huge amount about technology. But something I'm particularly interested in is the rise of the far right and the Cambridge Analytica stuff, but also particularly the rise of Bolsonaro and the use of WhatsApp and buying up all of those numbers and sending messages, what's called fake news, but misinformation. I know the term's been appropriated. So, and I just think in terms of encryption, how would you counter something where you're trying to protect people's privacy, but at the same time, these technically encrypted, I'm sure you guys know technology better, I'm sure there's loopholes there, but these platforms that are supposed to be private being used to spread misinformation.
I can start. So the case of WhatsApp in Brazil is particularly interesting because if you are a human rights / tech advocate, you have been advocating for the use of properly implemented open client-side end-to-end encryption, which is in a way, without the open part, what WhatsApp implements. And that's fantastic for the protection of your privacy and often your anonymity. At the same time, like the very same technology that you ask WhatsApp to implement doesn't allow WhatsApp to monitor the messages that go through the network, right? So that's one first kind of like conundrum of that bit. But at the same time, like there is two things. One is that it's a little bit tricky to put responsibility that should be responsibility of governments and companies, right? And it doesn't mean that there's technical avenues to do that, but there's probably legislative and other ways to deal with that. I think that this often happens with Facebook. We ask Facebook to be a monitor of human rights, right? It's an interesting thing, like asking them to take a look at what happened in Myanmar, right? Like it puts them in a position that is difficult both as a company and also it's a position that they shouldn't have. So the case in WhatsApp starts to open that conversation. The other part of this, and I think is just to force a point, I guess, is what is happening in terms of the massification of these weaponized tools. You're going to find more of them being often, and it's going to be very difficult to curb them technically. Right? You have this is not that different in the sense of like how the use of malware or has been now used by, again, Bolsonaro and around the elections also used that. I think it's a very interesting thing. Like it's going to be impossible to do that. And it also reminds me of, okay, this is silly and someone stop me if it goes too far, but so like if you were to look at images of maybe Libya, right, sometime around the time of, before the fall of Gaddafi, and you were to look at other conflicts, the one thing that you will see in most pictures will be a Toyota truck, right? Like that would be the truck of preference in all things. And it's like, well, this is a vehicle that everybody's using to, should we ban these vehicles, right? Like everybody's using them, maybe we could curb them. And And it probably is impossible to do something on WhatsApp at this point. I think that the solution, maybe is what the Finns are doing in terms of creating education at the K to 12 level, right? For them to understand how to deal with misinformation. Maybe the solution is not technical, right? Anyway, that's a bit of a random mumble.
I have a little bit of a different perspective just to spice it up. So I think the Toyota example is very interesting, and I use it a lot as a kind of question to a class or a group around where does the responsibility of a company stop and start? And that, from my perspective, would fall clearly in the you're linked to it in some way, but you're not contributing to the harm. Whereas a Facebook, especially on newsfeed rather than WhatsApp, which they also own, I think has a stronger responsibility in terms of the fact that they're contributing to an outcome by putting their finger on the scale of what is seen. So as they uprank content that is content that people engage with, and people like to engage with content that is controversial or stirring the pot in some ways, by putting the finger on the scale more through their algorithms, they're contributing to that having a wider audience. And therefore, I think their responsibility is a little bit different than the Toyota one, but I like the kind of brain exercise of trying to figure that out. I would say there's a question around rights compatibility and how you balance rights when they might be in tension. And I think one piece of that within it is this question of freedom of expression and the European versus the American perspective on that. I'm originally from Europe, I'm from London, so I kind of come from it from that perspective. And so I think that there is more room for limitations on free speech than I think a US company would typically see. And so there's questions around, does the right to free expression include the right to say false information that could cause harm, like anti-vaxxers, for example? Is that information that we as a society want to allow to be on platforms that can actually result in people not vaccinating themselves, not vaccinating their kids, potentially leading to other people who believe in vaccinations having their kids affected by it? So there are, I think, limitations that go beyond where we are in the US today. And it'd be interesting to hear from the OHCHR perspective in terms of where the human rights framework sees it, and there's new things that challenge us a little bit, right? I think there's clear limitations on hate speech in the International Human Rights Framework, but there's not on other more sensitive information that we're dealing with today, and I think that happened in the Bolsonaro case. And then this question of freedom of expression versus the right to privacy is essential and incredibly hard. And Facebook, I think in general, with its focus on groups, is not only looking at encryption for WhatsApp, but it's also looking at encryption on its own Facebook platform and through the group setting in that. And I think it presents a lot of concerns. I think someone else had a quote earlier today around the kind of the worst of our humanity can be shared on these platforms, and the speed and scale at which it can spread means that the impact is so much greater that we need to almost take a new lens to it and look at it in new ways. So it doesn't really answer your question, but there's a lot of kind of pieces to it that I think are really essential.
I would just give a really stark and unfortunately horrible example of exactly that. And I looked to my team in Afghanistan, where it was in the beginning of May, the Taliban attacked our offices in Kabul. And our team was huddled in a safe room for 6 hours as militants tried to blow off the doors and as Afghan security forces were coming in through the roof to try and save them and trying to clear the building. And none of us want to even imagine what those 6 hours were like for the people who were trapped in that safe room. Thank God the safe room worked and that they were not able to blow the lock off the door and to get in there. But as those people were being evacuated by the security forces, somebody took a picture of the team being evacuated because there was a significant event going on. And in this neighborhood, while there are a lot of attacks, unfortunately, in Afghanistan, and in Kabul in particular, this neighborhood was where the Attorney General is. It's where wealthier citizens live. And so it was not the usual place. And someone took a picture and posted it on Facebook. And the Taliban came onto Facebook and said, now we see the survivors, we're coming for every one of you. And that, first of all, is evidence of evil in the world, of course, but it's a terrible example of people's privacy being horribly invaded on a public platform, and yet none of us would object ostensibly to a picture of people leaving a building, because you wouldn't necessarily think that that is something that should be private. But of course, immediately in seeing that example, you see the terror that these people are now facing because their faces are on Facebook. And unfortunately, most of the people were women, and the Taliban attacked our office because they said Counterpart is promoting harmful practices, which is the intermixing of men and women. So there's an added target. This is exactly what they were trying to get us for. So I think as we think about public and private technology and spaces, to me, there's a blurring of them in ways that I couldn't have until the beginning of May have even imagined. And as I sat there as the leader of this organization that had just come under the most horrific attack, I found myself wanting Facebook to shut everything down. And yet I'm at the helm of an organization that's promoting civic engagement and free speech and open dialogue. So, I think these are issues that we don't even know the next dimensions of them. So when you ask the question about what the future is, it's really going to be very different, I think, because people are constantly finding even the most innocent thing, like a picture, to use that, to not just online harass, but physically intimidate.
I think she was very well here and there, and I'll try to do my best to.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for your presentations. My name is Marissa. I'm from Portugal. I'm a professor of law, and I have a question, mainly considering the last statement of Francesca and the risks of technology. I'll try to make some, introduction, if you'd like. I remember about a year ago of preparing an article for my journal about the Compass, which is a recidivism algorithm made by North Point, a private company, and it was used in Wisconsin, I believe. And what it does, it measures the impact of recidivism, or as you like, if criminals will do it again, or if there is needed for an incarceration or prison. So the algorithm measures the impact of having another crime. It was concluded by ProPublica, I believe it's a non-organizational movement, that the algorithm was racist. So we are commemorating, in between commas, the Plessy versus Ferguson judgment and the doctrine of separate but equal, but a new form of racism in the algorithm. So we have this private company with this secrecy related to this algorithm, and all the measures that it was used, it was concluded that, this one is racist because it's dependent on the diet that is fed on. But although the state of New Jersey, for instance, uses it for all its procedures, criminal procedures, obviously a different one from a public foundation, and there is no intellectual property, so anyone can relate to. First of all, we have here the problem of compatibility between private initiative, which is great because governments won't or can't do this research. And in this case, when it was used, a case where the Compass was used to measure this recidivism, it's called Loomis versus Wisconsin, and the Supreme Court decided, the defendant cannot access the algorithm because it's protected by intellectual property, and the defendant said, but it's my right to a due process, a fair process. I have this expert measuring me by my recidivism, and I cannot ever put it at stake. On the other hand, and relating to this, we have this emergence of technology, and it's a point. It will continue, obviously. It's no turning back. But this evolution of technology and this need to have this all kinds of technology, especially artificial intelligence one, And we have this fantastic humanoid, Sophia, which was granted citizenship. So we have this all post-humanist movements related to humanoids and robots. Curious, she has Saudi Arabian citizenship, and women's rights that are quite, well, I'll not comment on that. But all of this depends, and taking your words, Francesca, about the risks of this kind of technology in artificial intelligence, mainly big data, and mainly the ones that control big data. Why? Because in this case, we have this technology in the hands of private companies, not many private companies. So we have here a monopoly of information, and we have a technology in a broad sense, obviously, of artificial intelligence, whatever, you know it better than me, that can control the information that is fed for this kind of technology. So my question is, in these risks, we are all, obviously you, evaluating that there is a risk or not of the control of technology is put in hands of others that are not states. So we are mutating the idea of control, sovereignty, frontiers, and we're putting our future, and of course it is a moment of transformation, it is always, but the status quo as we know it of states, frontiers, despite of globalization, obviously not in the traditional sense, but sovereignty of states, the control of the ones of international actors that do not have profit as a main goal, and we are putting the control of our future in their hands. Is that a risk? Or what kind of measures can we, prepare now to at least control this risk? For instance, in the European Union, related to algorithms used in the criminal courts, they say, well, courts can use them, obviously, but they cannot be private, so that they cannot be protected by intellectual property. So everyone can.
So we can also have some time for it. But this is very important. I really appreciate that you're bringing things around algorithmic justice and bias, because it's one of those big themes of these days. My take on this, if you don't mind, is actually contradictory in a way, because on the one side, it's like, yes, this is something that is brings a significant risk, potentially harm, is something that we should be concerned. But it's something that is not new per se. Like if you think about the involvement of companies like Microsoft on the management of personal data in places like Chile or India, the nation state has already outsourced, very sensitive tasks to companies that have no other mandate but profit. So I think that bit is not surprising, it's not new, and I'm pretty sure that those of you studying kind of like history of technology will find other examples. So, and I'm saying this because in talking to a friend who is an anthropologist, she's telling me, like, look, keep in mind that the conversation itself is boxing in you. Like you're forced to talk about the today as if the future, as if this is out of, as if everything is new. So that's one bit of the response. I don't think that any of this is new, and I think that we can take a look at the harms that have been produced by outsourcing this. The states in particular has outsourced a lot of the roles of the states to technology companies. The other side of this is interesting, which is what we can do. And perhaps one thing that I meant to mention before is, so one of the interesting things about the moment that we live as civil society is that, and this is, I think, a source of optimism, is that the moment that we're living also is showing civil society that is much more active about issues of technology. So if you think about the beginning of the internet, right? It took several years for organizations like the Electronic Frontier Foundation, a bunch of European organizations to exist and start to become effective advocates. It took a while, and if you go one generation before, you're going to find that there was a delay in terms of the response from civil society. When algorithmic bias became an issue, civil society responded really, really fast. It took only a year or two for something like the Fairness and Accountability and Transparency Conference to exist, like a year or two for AI Now in New York to exist. There was a faster response, and I think that there is a large, you can think actually at Philip Alston, which is a special rapporteur on extreme poverty, and whose most of his work over the last year has been around digital welfare and the risk of that type of discrimination, mostly interested in the type of harms that will come to the beneficiaries of social welfare. So on the one hand, I don't think that any of this is new, and I think that what we can take a look is how civil society is actually responding. There's a lot of these risks that I think are being mitigated. There are people at the moment finding methods to be able to deconstruct algorithms. A lot of this is happening in the US, and a lot of this is happening in New York, which is unfair and shows a lot of another conversation about how power is concentrated. But that will be my reaction to that, if someone wants to add.
No, maybe just, it may not be new, but I think the quantity of data available today, I think bring the problem to a different scale. And so I think the issue of concentration of data in the hands or whatever, the databases of a few, I think is an important issue that is very linked to the impact on human rights of technologies that are based on the availability of big data and favor concentration of data, because the more concentration, the more, the better the work, right? So I think that's in terms of how to mitigate this, there is something thinking to be done in terms of what belongs to self-regulation, cause of conduct, what else can be done in terms of states adopting legal frameworks that limit that. I mean, I think there are some suggestions about sort of third parties, independent entities managing data rather than the companies themselves, so to add a level of independence to this very worrying phenomenon of concentration of big data about people in the hands of private companies, for example. So I think there is definitely something that is critical to whether technological transformations are going to improve our life, our enjoyment of human rights or not.
Just a few points on that really quickly. So one, I think this question of state versus company is really interesting, and I've done a bunch of impact assessments for technology companies, including social media platforms, in Asia, Southeast Asia and South Asia. And I asked the question, who do you want to control your data? And by and large, they say Mark Zuckerberg. And then I talked to my business partner who's from Germany, and he very strongly believes in the state, and he goes state over any private entity because there's some level of accountability. So the experiences that people have had in terms of the degree to which their rights are respected by the state very much impacts who they want to control the data and have access to the data. So I think that's one just important nuance to your question. And the second piece, I think, that's really important is around the right to remedy. You're talking about the case of recidivism rates. And in that case, they realized that it was partially determined by an algorithm. But in a lot of cases, people don't know that it's not human oversight that makes a decision about their life. So whether it's the Amazon algorithm that has bias against women, or it's what loans you see on your Facebook newsfeed, or X, Y, and Z, there needs to be some sort of alert mechanism to make you aware that a decision about your life has been made by a machine of some sort, so that you at least have a way to raise a red flag and make a request for it to be reviewed by a human.
But I also think, I think there's many levels of who owns the data, but it's also about who creates the data and who creates the algorithms, right? And I think there is more and more of a conversation about bias in analysis and algorithm creation and data analysis. And I think one of the reasons, not to harp on this, but like Facebook is in the position it's in is because most of their user policies have been written by white men. And the reason that the recidivism algorithm is biased is because the people who wrote it probably don't have experiences in that field or are not representative of the communities that are most affected by incarceration. And so I think that at a very basic level, it's actually about understanding where our data comes from and how it's created and how it's produced, and that a white male sort of data collection is going to be different than people of different diverse backgrounds, and how they potentially look at and analyze the data and come up with the criteria in which our rights and our our rights are going to be affected. And I think that's where the human rights lens has to start, is like who is creating the data and making sure that we're asking those questions.
Great. Hi.
Hi, I'm Teresa Harris. I'm with the AAAS Scientific Responsibility Human Rights and Law Program. Thank you for thank you so much for organizing this really important conversation. It feels like, so you've talked a lot about the dual use problem. It's a lot of times it feels like we're stuck in this, the risks versus the benefits versus the how it helps activism, and it feels very much, in thinking about it in terms of the history of the human rights movement, it feels very similar to the movement for framing access to healthcare as a human right, and particularly related to HIV, AIDS and HIV medication, where the big challenge, the big turning point, the big tipping point in that was framing an alternative approach to access to medicines and access to healthcare that dismissed the profit-based model for developing and delivering those medicines and coming up with an alternative to that. And it feels like in the conversations that happen around technology and human rights that we're in that same kind of moment where we should be coming up with, instead of being stuck with how do we make Facebook better, how do we make Twitter better, how do we make it safer, what are we going to do about deepfakes, actually saying what's the technology that we need developed? Why isn't there as much investment being made in developing really strong privacy technology as much as is being put into developing digital identity at the UN, for example, which the UNDP is sinking a lot of money into developing digital identity, and we're not seeing the same private investment or public investment in the privacy that's needed to really have that address the human rights concerns it could, that it has the potential to. And the same in healthcare, which is kind of where I've made this connection, that there's a big move for digital-based healthcare that has the potential to radically transform access to healthcare, but only if the other technology that needs to go along with it, are we going to be able to achieve that? If you had the opportunity, as people who do a lot of thinking about this, to tell the world to put together a vision for what's the new technology we actually need and that we want made regardless of the profit model, and we'll figure out how to get private and academia and everybody involved in that. What would be your vision you'd put forward?
That's so cool. Thank you.
You have thoughts, I think.
Yeah. So I like the idea of public health. It always I find it fascinating, both in either epidemiology or public health, to look at societal issues. It's always really interesting. It also includes a lot of bioinformatics, which is interesting and exciting. My first reaction when you were saying is that I think but there's the state, right? The state played a role somehow and say, well, this is of public interest, right? We're just going to either alter regulation or create some framework for that to be developed in the public interest. In the case of the state, probably did involve creating a future market for those companies so they can invest now, right, and have some profit over time. But I think that there is a different, it would be very interesting to have an office of kind of a public health, but for technology, right? And what I think, and this is going to be not super random, but I think that there's something happening right now that has a lot of potential, and it's coming out of the state, and there is this idea of public interest technology. And it's mostly kind of pushed out of the Ford Foundation, and it's probably something that is emulating a public interest law, and Ed Rakosh is here, who is one of the founders of that space. I think that the interesting thing, as a vision, and this is kind of a compromise, because my true vision is a bit more radical and revolutionary, but I think that what we see today is the possibility, it's plausible. How is it possible? Plausible. That we create some infrastructure for us to think about public interest technology. Now, this has happened. There has been attempts. If you think about the DRL or the Open Technology Fund, the US government has attempted to do this, mostly for a foreign policy effort. And here and then has succeeded. I have not seen that as a national endeavor outside of some things related to access over the last 20 years. But again, in short, I think that what I think is possible is to take advantage that there's a beginning conversation around public interest technology that we can co-opt and make into something much more complex and rich.
I think the concept of technology as a public good is an important one, and I think it's something that we need to have more of a conversation about. And I think the role of the state is critical. I mean, your question is about what are the new technologies, and you know, I think that so where my mind goes oftentimes is like, how do we create a culture where that is where new technologies are possible and new publicly funded, public good technologies are funded, and how do we sort of supersede what the current culture is, at least in the US, which is, you know, Silicon Valley will figure it out and will invest millions of dollars into that. And I think if we can actually look at NGOs and educational institutions and research that are more focused on that rather than looking at sort of the market, I think that's sort of where we need to shift the conversation. So you started off talking about narratives, and I'm, you know, what I'm thinking about is like a broader narrative around the role of technology and how we see technology, how we use technology, and how we're able to innovate technology in ways that are truly driven by public need, rather than sort of what it is currently. Yeah.
I just wanted to comment on the process and maybe to think about a more bottom-up approach. Some of the most interesting meetings I've been while working in this area in the past 5-6 years are meetings in which we brought together technology experts and human rights people, officers, practitioners, to precisely to have that conversation. Obviously, this is at a micro level, if you want, rather than, you know, public policy level. But they're starting from the needs, which is what you referred to. So let us try to explain to you, tech experts, in very simple terms, what is my daily job, and this is my problem. I'm not a tech expert, but do you have a way of solving it? And it's very useful conversations because it's a mutual discovery of of what one can do for the other. And that led on at least a couple of occasions to tech companies engaging with us to develop tailored technologies to solve problems we had raised in those settings. So I'm just thinking, I think there is a need for that on a much broader scale, and I don't know how that can be facilitated in terms of the more we speak, starting from the needs, and I agree without taking the current technology as as a fact that obviously that will not change, or as the ceiling, but just having a totally open conversation about these are what our needs as members of this society or this community, human rights community, to keep it narrower if possible. Are, and how can technology address the technologies that don't exist, address them? I think that's for us that has been an extremely viable process, and it's not been UN internal. It's open to others.
I don't know if anybody has anything to add. Or?
I think it's such an important question you raised, and I'm really glad you did. And I think I'm going to appear like I'm from the dark ages when I say this, but to me, I don't think we're using all the technologies we currently have for the public good. And I think about one of my favorite programs that I've seen anywhere addressing health issues, and it was in Bangladesh, and it was called the Info Ladies. And so the Info Ladies rode around the villages on their bicycles, which was already a very radical thing to do because women didn't ride bicycles. And so already that was a huge social change, but it gave them greater mobility, and what they were doing was healthcare. So they would go on their bicycles door to door to these houses, and yet what they had in the back of their bicycle was an iPad. And they were able to then connect into health posts that were maybe not in Dhaka, maybe they were 30 miles away in 40 miles away, and they could get information then about the symptoms and what they might mean, and things that, you know, otherwise people would have died from, but you could discern then, should this person be moved to the nearest clinic, or is this something that, you know, the info lady had her pack of pills and her very limited supplies, but could she address it while she was there? And so I look to those solutions because first and foremost, it's the interface, of course, of the human and the technology together for public good. And I think many of us get very excited about technology and think about the prospects of it and the potentials of it and the things we can't even imagine yet. And yet, when we're working at the base levels where people are, you know, not connected, don't have access to resources, are intimidated by technology, those solutions will always, always fail. You know, there is no magic bullet in technology. And what we need is that interface. And then the second thing I would say is I get very nervous when we think about technology for the public good, because I immediately see the market leaving. And, you know, I sit in an organization that is funded largely by bilateral development assistance. And I can tell you that's a pretty hard place to be, to rely on government funding right now at this moment. And so I would never, ever want healthcare innovations or education innovations or anything else driven from the public good side, because I fear that while you're probably working with some very forward-leaning corporations that, you know, may want to engage that way, and they're out there, others will not. And you drive away innovation, and you know, probably lose the business model that is going to help these companies want to remain engaged, because, you know, they're in there to make profit, and if social good happens alongside of that, it's a win-win. But the minute we say it's a public good, you know, I can see the room clearing.
I think, too, one point following up on Francesca, and I think there's a process piece not only in terms of bringing coders and engineers to speak with human rights practitioners about technologies we can develop for human rights, but also bringing human rights people to engineers and coders to say, hang on, you haven't thought about the human rights implications of this, and using that as a mitigation or prevention frame. And then to answer your specific question about a technology, it's this great question, and I'm a little bit nervous to say this because I have not thought about all the unintended consequences. But we've talked a lot about social media today, and I wonder if there's a way to blend the work of psychology and behavioral economics and nudges and bring them in together to create a platform that taps into our best selves rather than our worst selves. And what would that look like? How do we build in empathy? How do we build in care and respect into a global platform where people can talk to each other? I have no idea if it's possible. I have no idea what the negative consequences are. But if we instead of focus on eyeballs and instead focus on community and resilience and empathy, what would that look like?
I think it's necessary to think about what is the incentive to create technology, right? Because right now it's profit, right? So how do you balance that? But it's not necessarily the only. And I would like to, in thinking of incentives, there's two things that came from listening to Francesca. And there is one is about incentives, like the AAAS that you represent, this is the American Association for the Advancement of Science, is about to announce this year their first ever Human Rights Innovation Award. And I'm saying that because there's things like that that could create, you know, a non-monetary incentive for, you know, technology in the public interest. The second thing that came to mind is something that you mentioned before, and it's about, you mentioned the sandbox, you know, for regulatory issues. And one thing that I remember talking to some of you is, why is that we don't have, let's say, there's a new piece of technology that comes, there's a new provider, there should be someone taking a look at that and says, like, look, this is going to be the human rights impact of your work, right? And this is going to be the promise that you have for human rights practice. Something like what Consumer Reports will do with a new washing machine. I said, like, well, this is really going to break in 6 months or not. But anyway, like, it's almost the time that we need to end. So why don't we have, like, one last question and maybe one last round? I think that someone over there had a hand. Oh, I'm sorry, you had a hand for a long time. I'm really sorry. We'll take two, I guess. Why don't we take two at the same time?
Right
yes. One and one, and then we'll reply to both.
You want me to start?
We'll take both at the same time, and then we'll answer to that.
Okay. I'm Tom Quinn. I'm here with the Lifelong Learning Institute. And I was struck by a couple things that were said by the panelists. You saying that social movements are the bedrock of the human rights struggle, and the idea of looking at technology being weaponized. We're talking about in the surveillance. And I've been following what I consider a virtual social movement online. And it's called, there was a recent summit online with 40 expert people, scientists, PhDs, lawyers, others, the 5G crisis. It's the 5th generation mobile technology that's coming. And Friday morning, you're going to have a technology panel. You got somebody from the law school that's going to be talking about the Internet of Things, which ties in with 5th generation mobile technology. It ties in with the artificial intelligence. And what's going on is, well, let me get right
yeah, let's try to do that because we have 5 minutes.
Right, I know. So I'm going to get right to the core. There's more than 200 PhD scientists and others, different parts of the world, that have petitioned the United Nations to have a moratorium on the rollout of this 5th generation technology because of the harms that have been demonstrated. There should be independent studies. This is being ignored by the United Nations as bastion of human rights. In addition, the Secretary General has been confronted by staff, especially with those working in Switzerland, of harm happening to the United Nations workers with this technology. This is rolling out into our neighborhoods. And I think this could possibly be a future human rights struggle. And I just wanted to share that with you.
We'll take that. I can answer that. I can take care of the 5G.
That you would comment.
And let's pass to our colleague just because we have 5 minutes. But thank you. 5G, and let's take another one, and then we can just split answers. Thank you for being patient for all of you. I was doing not the perfect job because you didn't stood up all the time. Yes, she's there. Let's.
Hi, thank you for facilitating such an interesting conversation, first of all. My question is that in the age of global social media technology and the clean ingredients movement within the environmental sustainability movement, how do we as consumers and activists work towards challenging the beauty industry by both demanding transparency in the narrative and sourcing of these clean ingredients such as cocoa, mica, and shea, and confronting the old power structures within the beauty industry, especially within a society that fast fashion consumerism and social media is so prevalent?
Great.
Thank you.
So I suggest that we kind of like take some of the questions. I can start with the 5G, and maybe we can do a last round. I have one final question for us. So the 5G is super interesting in many ways, right? It actually has the potential to alter what we can do, especially with mobiles first, but also it's going to create a big market for other devices. As you were mentioning, the Internet of Things, that is devices that are connected to the Internet that can move in and out data, that collect data. It's probably going to alter a lot of the things that we do. It has a lot of potential, for example, for environmental work. You're going to be able to monitor, vast distances. It operates differently. It requires more antennas closer by. It also changes potentially the way the antennas are distributed and has the potential to change access and create a different type of divide. An urban area is going to become much more relevant for a company than a rural area. That said, I think that in terms of the things that we're doing, perhaps is much more about access than traditional human rights issues because technically it's better. It's a much better technology for the transmission of data. There's a presentation that, and I'm sorry I forgot his name, but he's German, that someone did at RHIZE in Tunisia earlier this year, and I have found that to be the most sophisticated kind of connection between human rights issues and the reality of 5G. The issues around the studies that had to do with harm, like the harms of signals, are something that I think I will take with a pinch of salt, but the ones about the provision of access are the ones that I have found the most valid. Maybe someone else wants to speak to the other aspect or to the same. There's another question. But
on the beauty question, I would just say we do a lot of work outside of the tech sector, including with the apparel and footwear sector and the beauty sector, and a lot of that is focused on reformulating the way that companies are viewing risk. So not looking at it in terms of risk to supply chain disruptions, but looking at it from risk to rights holders and focusing resources and capacity building dollars on addressing those risks. So the concerns about child labor and forced labor in the mic industry, things like that, and trying to figure out how do you both use corporate leverage to push for more stringent regulation in the countries where this is happening, and then 2, work with civil society to address root causes, I think are the 2 kind of big pieces that we've been talking about and pushing in relation to addressing those pieces that aren't quite at tier 1 in your supply chain.
Yeah, I think that the most important thing is really fostering greater awareness, because you're clearly very steeped in these issues and you know to look at the sourcing, but we still see so many people in the world are just blindly buying what they see, and so until they're aware, until they've been activated, and I think we can't forget that that is such a critical first step. And then the second thing I think is using your purchasing power in the ways that, stand behind your values. And if you look at the last 10, 15 years in the fashion industry, it's a completely different time. The fact that we're having conversations around disposable clothing, or the fact that people understand now, some people understand, that child labor or forced labor, has been used to make clothes in Bangladesh or in various places. People don't want to buy that anymore. And I don't know if the Kathy Lee Gifford scandal was the watershed moment, but the times have changed, and yet it hasn't changed enough. And so I look to think about how can we use technology to get everybody aware about these issues, and how can we use the power of Facebook when we see a product that's online that is ethically sourced. How do we promote that? How do we try and shut down other products that are not? So I think there's such a role for activism and the basic education in this area that's encouraging, but we're not far enough for sure.
Great, so we're almost there, and we're landing, right? You're safe and sound, and you're going to be able to make it to the reception. But before you before you remove your seatbelts, I would like to ask us, just one quick question. If you think there's some students here, this university that is forming a new generation of practitioners, what would be that one quick advice that you could give for someone that is going to become, the next you?
I'm going to plagiarize from someone whose name I can't remember, similar to you. It was a headline for an op-ed, and it was "Move slow and fix things."
Great.
I would say there's 3 things that you have to think about. The first is approaching all of this with humility, because as you can see, nobody knows everything. And the failure piece that you brought up at the beginning is the most powerful teacher you'll ever have. And I think you also have to focus in on community. None of this is going to come to solution or resolution without a community of people around it. And I think what Facebook and other platforms have done has taught us that there's different forms of community than physical and face-to-face. And then I think the most important thing is about agency. So if you were a student sitting here, I would encourage you to think about whose agency matters, and that it's not your agency that we're looking to promote, it's the agency of people who are affected by the challenges.
Thank you.
Even when you have to dress conservatively, act subversively.
We need T-shirts that say that.
Like that. So one thought is look to things that have worked. And so I actually was going to add to the last question, which is, when I think about what could potentially help transform the beauty industry, look to the food movement, look to fast fashion, look to the fashion industry, and think about some of the creative tactics that do exist. I like to play a game with myself of is it possible to never buy a new piece of clothing, right? There's a lot of technology out there that allows us to buy secondhand clothing now. That's really amazing. And so it's about that and using technology as a way to develop alternatives and make things more accessible. And think about things from a cultural lens, a political lens, and a behavioral lens, and seeing that change as cyclical and interconnected. I think that, to the last question around, what would I say? I think one of the things I'm reflecting on in this panel is the tension and conversation on excitement around new technology, and to Ann's point that so much of the technology that exists already can be amplified and put to better use. And the thing that is exciting is that connection between human interface and technology, and I think that's really so much of what kind of gets me excited. And I think it's a question of like how do we all help put more of a human lens on human rights and on technology, and how do we operate from that centerpiece of human values, human-driven design, and kind of human rights values. So when people may be pushing you to innovate, kind of take a step back, go back and say, like, there's actually some basics here that we may be missing. So,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I will close with a quote that I'm practicing kind of like in daily life, which is about the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the will, which comes from Gramsci's work. And I'll suggest for that to be somewhere there in the back. But anyway, thank you for flying with us. We're landing. You're free to go to the reception. And I just want to thank all of you and the university for being here. So awesome. Thanks.
Thank you.
So hopefully drinks and music and networking and standing outside, getting some fresh air awaits all of you. Thank you so much for your time, and thanks again to the panel.